Hi, I'm Sean Markey. Welcome to another episode of Our Antique Treasures, and I think we've got quite a good show for you today. First of all, we're going to talk to Ed Halderson about mid-century modern. That's a very up-and-coming area of collecting. And we're also going to talk to Lauren Garland about a really interesting area of collecting, that is ginger beer bottles. And you'll be surprised as to what some of those are worth. Anyway, please stay with me and join us for what I think is going to be a great show.
It was my daughter's birthday. She was blowing out the candles on our cake when we heard coming from the TV. So we stopped and listened, and it helped us get to safety. That's why when I think of my daughter's birthday, because now she gets to keep having them.
My first guest is a young dealer, Ed Halderson, who has quickly made a name as having excellent antiques, collectibles, and art. He finds very good things, and collectors are quick to check in with him at the antique shows. He's with us today to talk about mid-century modern, a very popular area of collecting. I want to welcome Ed to our show. Welcome, Ed.
Thanks, Sean.
Maybe we could start with a quick definition of mid-century modern. Just what is it? What does it encompass?
Mid-century modern would encompass decorative arts and architecture from about the end of World War II up until 1970.
Okay. And why do you like the mid-century modern items, and what got you started?
Well, I started liking mid-century items because they're so different from everything that came before them. Every recognized designer or company seems to have broken all of the style rules that preceded them, so everything you see is fresh, different, colorful, interesting.
So you've brought some interesting things to talk about tonight. Why don't we go around the table here and have a chat about these things?
Sure.
Where would you like to start?
I'll start with the salt and pepper shakers.
Okay.
These were made by a Canadian couple named Erica and Kjeld Dijkman, who came over from a Scandinavian country in the 1930s and settled in rural New Brunswick just outside of St. John. Mm-hmm. And they started making pottery. The husband, Kjeld, would throw pots, and the wife, Erica, would make glazes. And together they made hundreds of different types of pottery forms and hundreds of different types of glazes in different combinations. These ones are somewhat abstract, which is unusual for their work. They've taken a vase, turned it like so, and just flattened the bottom. So they sit as salt and pepper shakers at a bit of an angle. Also very typical of their work is to have little figures painted on the side. They also incised and molded three-dimensional figures, but this is a very typical painted face. So they're quite cute.
It's a very unusual form for a salt and pepper shaker.
It is, and that's part of the kind of lightheartedness and funness. They were very popular in New Brunswick because their items were affordable, they were very cheerful, they were small and easy to carry, and they gained a lot of press and popularity because of that.
So what's the value of a salt and pepper shaker made by the Dijkmans these days?
I have never seen another pair like it, but the cost for me to acquire it was about $300.
Okay, okay. Now there's a pot right beside you there that's got a very interesting form. Tell us about that.
This pot I would call abstract. They've taken a simple vase form and made it look somewhat cubic and abstract by shaping the edges of the pot to have very strong stylized lines. They've also incised the glaze with some kind of comb or compass to go around two sort of central points. You can't really see it on camera, but it's got a tremendous amount of weight and thickness for a small pot.
Is it clay?
Yes, it is clay. We don't know a lot about this potter. He studied in Japan, and he moved to Hinton, Alberta in 1967 or 68.
What's his name?
His name is Toru Hasegawa, and the only thing we know about him is the few pots that he left behind.
So that must be a rare pot.
It is, and it's the nicest example of his work that I've seen.
And what's the value on something like that?
I paid $250 for it, but I'm not sure how much it would sell for on the open market if a second one came up.
Now let's talk about this spectacular lamp here.
Well, this lamp encompasses everything that was popular in the brutalist philosophy. So they had repeated modular units, thick, heavy, exposed materials. In architecture, you'd see it as big, repeating concrete slabs. In decorative arts, you'd see it, in this case, as sort of cut steel beams that are repeated and joined together to form a lamp. And they're not hidden at all with any decorative elements. So you just see the exposed steel beams.
It's very heavy.
It's extremely heavy. It probably weighs about 40 or 50 pounds.
Yeah, that's. It's really an interesting thing. It's literally bolted together.
It is probably a combination of bolted and welded. It's signed H. Lewis on the bottom. I have no idea who that was, but it's a case where you like the design so much that you don't really care if there's a branded name behind it or a following. You just kind of compelled to acquire it and put it at home and find a place for it.
Absolutely. Do you think it's American or Canadian?
I wouldn't even be able to guess.
Okay.
Yeah, but if somebody did bring it across the sea, it would be very heavy.
Yes, right. No, it's a beautiful lamp. And this must be an ice bucket?
This is an ice bucket, and it's an example of Scandinavian design that was very prevalent in the mid-century years. And this is by one of the luminaries of that period, or one of the most recognized designers. His name is Finn Juhl. It's an unusual small ice bucket by him. It's very understated and simple. It's got a steel base with a teak top. And you grab it with two little mortised out handles. One of the things I like the most about it is that as soon as you open the bucket, it reveals a very colorful interior, sort of all business on the outside, all party on the inside.
Right, right. Now you mentioned the top is teak. Now teak is, there's a lot of teak was used in mid-century modern furniture.
Teak was a very popular wood that was used because it's very durable, it's very easy to finish, it's very easy to maintain, and I'm assuming they had it sourced in large quantities that could support the manufacturing for distributing it worldwide for all the makers that were using in Denmark.
Right, there were a lot of Danish furniture designers and manufacturers.
Yep.
We see their furniture here in this country that was retailed here in the 1970s.
Yep.
That's what collectors are looking for?
Well, Finn Juhl actually started designing in the 1940s, far before Danish modern became mainstream. What you see in the 1960s and 70s is sort of the second generation of teak pieces. This is from the early years, I think from the early to mid-1950s. He jumped from company to company, first with Niels Wouters, and in this case, a company called Torben Orskov. And you often see where a designer worked for a company, did a range of designs, and then the company would manufacture them. So for each design you see out there, there's often a designer and a manufacturer associated with it.
And that brings us to this very interesting abstract work here in the frame.
This is an abstract work by a Canadian artist named Andre Beeler. He was born in Europe and moved to Canada as a young child and served in World War I. And then he studied again throughout Europe and Canada in different art schools. If you look at his early work, it would be very reminiscent of the painters he painted with, the Group of Seven and the Beaver Hall Group in Montreal. Later on in the 1930s, he became a resident teacher at Queen's University. And this would date from somewhere in that period of 1936 when he started to somewhere in the mid to late 50s when he stopped working there. And we know that because it's actually painted on a teaching card. If you look on the back, you can see that it's painted at Queen's University. And when I initially bought it, it had a mat on it. But when I opened the mat up, I saw this lovely perforated card that it was painted on. So when I framed it, I decided to leave that exposed.
Very good.
Yeah.
Now this guy here, he
This
looks a
is-
little more recent.
This, it looks slightly more recent, but it's still from the 1970s. It's done by a Canadian ceramic artist named Ed Drahanchuk, and I brought it as an example of kitsch. You have basically a vase that's turned just like any other vase, and then he's molded appliques, he's incised and painted the back, he's made audacious horns for the bowl, with cute little googly eyes, and to cap it all off, if that wasn't kitschy enough, he's actually put little bells hanging from its neck. He studied out west, and he did a lot of other vases that looked similar to it. This is one of only two, they're called goobles, that I've seen.
Okay. Very, very interesting. And the last item here is this very interesting small piece here, this sculpture.
So I've always felt that Inuit art was a very important part of modern design and modern art, and coincidentally it started commercially mainstream around the early 1950s. So this I brought as an example of surrealism, where a carver has in his imagination a spirit or a monster of some sort. We don't know for sure, and like many great early pieces, it's not identified or signed in any way that we can track it down. The only thing we do know about it is that it's from Arctic Quebec, probably Port Harrison, and we know that because of the dark green stone with little orange veins in it.
Very good, very good. And we only have a minute left, Ed, but I wanted to ask you what advice you would have for somebody just wanting to jump into the mid-century field. Where should they start? Where should they go?
Well, I would jump in with an open mind. I would look at as many references and examples as you can to develop your own taste and interest and knowledge. And don't feel an urgency to buy something just because it's available. Take your time learning and collecting, and pieces will sort of find you.
That's very good advice. Well, thanks for coming in and sharing information about these wonderful pieces.
You're quite welcome. Thanks, Sean.
Like many of us, our next guest, Lauren Garland, is a collector who has collections within his collection. He's with us to discuss a special area of collecting, decorated ginger beer bottles from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. He is known among collectors for his attention to detail, not only in the stoneware bottle area, but in all areas of his collecting. It's my pleasure to welcome Lauren to the show.
Hi, Sean. It's good to be here.
Nice to have you, Lauren. So let's start with some general questions, Lauren. When were these fabulous ginger beer bottles manufactured?
They came along in the mid-1800s and evolved slightly during that period. You can see different sorts of closures on these, for example, different shapes. And then they were pretty well gone by 1920, 25, that kind of area.
Now, are they all made of clay?
They're made of a very heavy stoneware clay, thrown on a wheel typically, and as you would any piece of stoneware.
And how were the names and the labels put on the bottles?
That's an interesting thing, because the first ones that came out didn't have names on them, and names were impressed into them. But at some point in the later 1800s, the process of transfer printing was developed, by which the label that you see on there is designed and then it's inked onto the bottle before the glazing process. Once it's then put in the kiln and fired, that's on there, well, as you can see, pretty much forever.
So where were they manufactured?
In the earlier days, in the late 1800s, when these transfer printed beers came along, they were primarily made in the UK, Glasgow, Edinburgh, places like that, Lambeth. And they were used because a lot of what was going from Canada to the UK was heavy, lumber, coal, that sort, not coal to Newcastle, but they needed ballast for the ships to come over this way. So there's a product that's nice heavy ballast, but it can be sold when it gets here.
And the images then were put on here?
No, the images were put on at the pottery in the UK.
Oh, okay.
Now, there developed a number of Canadian potteries, and there are some examples here in Ontario, in St. John, and in Medicine Hat, which is actually still going today.
And why do collectors collect these bottles?
Why do collectors collect anything?
True.
They get turned on to an interest in some particular kind of thing, and as you can see with this, there's quite a variety. These are all Canadian, and they were made literally from coast to coast. We have examples here from New Brunswick right across to British Columbia.
Well, let's talk about a rare one. Let's talk about the rarest one on the table, which I think is the one closest to you.
The large one closest to me with, I mean, how much more Canadian can you get than to have a picture of a beaver on your ginger beer? There are perhaps 3 of those known. We're not entirely sure. Just as soon as you say that, another one comes out of the woodwork somewhere, but that's pretty rare.
And can you talk about a little bit about what else is here that you would classify as a hard-to-find bottle?
Actually, the next one to its left with the horse jumping through the horseshoe from Strathroy, Ontario. It's quite a lovely design on the label, and while there are more of those around, they're still in the quite rare category.
Now, how about Ottawa bottles?
You have one right in front of you, an extremely intricate design, which is from Ottawa. There are maybe 8 or 10 different transfer printed ginger beers from the Ottawa area, and of course, to a collector from Ottawa, they're very collectible.
And why did these bottles go out of fashion?
Well, you can see on some of the labels, this one with the beaver on it, for example, it says this bottle is always the property of the company. So this was early recycling. These bottles went back to the bottler, got perhaps washed out, and then refilled and sold again. Well, it's the perhaps washed out part that probably weighed on people's minds. So when inexpensive glass bottles came along, you could really see what you were getting. These just disappeared.
And went out of fashion.
About 1925, yeah.
How important is condition when you're collecting the bottles? How important is condition to them in terms of value?
As with many collectibles, condition is, I think, extremely important. You can, if you know you're talking value, knock about half the value off something if it has a crack in the side or a chip in the lip or something like that. I mean, it's amazing that these have survived for 100, 150 years. So that's why it becomes really important to the collector to find one that's in pristine condition.
So give me a sense of value across the table here. What kinds of value? Now I realize we're here in 2018, but and you may have acquired some of these a long time ago, but give me a sense of current market value on some of these.
There's an interesting broad range. We have from perhaps one of the rarest, although perhaps not one of the highest priced bottles. There are others that might fetch a slightly higher price for various reasons, but let's say that the Pelissier with the beaver on it is worth $4,000. Some of the other bottles on the table are in the kind of $200 to $400 range. And just to show that it's not a hobby that's restricted to people with a lot of money, I've actually brought some in that are in the order of $50 to $60. So it's an easy hobby to get started in. It's only when you get hooked that you get caught with the big price items.
How many bottles are in your collection?
About 100.
100. And do you have everything that you could possibly have, or are you still looking for some rare ones?
No, it's interesting. You know, some people collect based on area, some color, some on the design that's on the label. Some people only like animal labels, for example. I like the Ottawa ginger beers because of my location, and there's one particular Ottawa ginger beer that was made exclusively for the Chateau Laurier, and that's a very hard bottle to find in good condition. And so if one of those were to walk into my house, I would not be disappointed.
So you don't have one of those in your collection?
I have one, but it's not in what you'd call very good condition. Yeah.
So can damaged bottles be repaired or restored, and what effect does that have on value, and do you want a repaired bottle in your collection, or does that make it an undesirable?
That's a tricky question, and I suppose it relates a lot to the rarity of the bottle. Generally, repair has a negative effect on the price, but there are people out there now who are capable of doing such a good repair that you can't tell that one has been done. We rely on the honesty of other collectors to indicate if there's been a repair done, and then you can decide yourself whether the rarity of that bottle and the fact that you don't have one moves you towards having it in your collection. I wouldn't be opposed to having a nicely repaired Chateau Laurier, for example. Yeah.
What advice would you give someone who wants to just get started in ginger beer bottle collecting? Where should they start? I mean, do you go to auctions? Do you go to dealers? Do you go to other collectors? How do you start?
Yeah, I got started by finding a ginger beer in an antique store, and I had absolutely no idea what it was, except it was a really neat stone bottle that said O'Keeffe's on it, and I thought, gee, that's something different. Then I started researching. There's a wealth of information available online. If you're fortunate enough to be able to come across a copy of transfer printed Ginger Beers of Canada by Scott Wallace and Phil Culhane, that's the definitive book on the subject. Unfortunately, it's now out of print.
Out of print.
But, you know, scour the antique shows and the auctions and you might get lucky. Antique shows do have them, and so do shops. But talking with another collector would probably be the best way to gain a lot of knowledge.
What about garage sales and estate sales, yard sales? Do ginger beer bottles turn up there?
They do, but they're pretty rare. The more you want them, the rarer they are.
And what, if you had to add just one more bottle to your collection, what would it be?
Well, I guess it would probably be that Chateau Laurier. Yeah.
That's top of your list.
If I could find a mint one of those, yeah.
Right. Well, I want to thank you for coming in, Lauren, and telling us about this fascinating area of collecting. And good luck looking for that Chateau Laurier bottle.
Thank you. We'll do our best.
During our interviews, we'll be using several terms related to antiques. Words like condition, provenance, form. I thought it might be helpful if I took just a couple of minutes and went over these terms one at a time so that we're all clear on their meanings as related to antiques. Let's start with the word surface. Now, we've used this word several times in the interviews. As the word implies, we're talking about the actual exterior surface of the piece. Now, we tend to hear this word frequently in connection with furniture or antiques made from wood, although surface also comes into play with items made from metal, stone, ceramics, any material for that matter. I mean, every object has a surface. So, one of the first things a collector thinks about when examining the surface of an antique is originality. In other words, is the surface original? By that I mean, is the surface as it exists the same one that was applied when the object was made? Now, it may be 100, 150, 200 years or older, but is it the original surface? Quite often it is. Now, the varnish may be darkened, paint may be worn in spots, there could even be some damage to the piece. But if the surface is original, that's important. Why is it important? Good question. The answer is that the original surface reflects the age and the life of the piece. Every rub mark, every scratch, every dent adds up to the story of that piece. And if you remove that surface or surfaces, you're removing the life story of the antique. Now, back in the 1960s and after that, collectors and dealers routinely removed original surfaces. We all did it. They had furniture pieces stripped and refinished. The look of the natural wood was what they were after. That's what we wanted back then. But in removing the original surface, you essentially remove much of the history of the piece, its history of use. Now, I'm not saying that removing the surface of a piece is a bad thing in all cases. Many antiques need restoration. Often their surfaces are not original and they can't be saved, or their surfaces have been totally altered over the years anyway. In those cases, refinishing is definitely an option. But advanced collectors typically are after an original or early surface, or a surface they can live with. And by that I mean sometimes because a piece is rare or of such a unique form that the best plan is to not touch the existing surface at all. Simply live with the surface as is, even if that surface is several coats of paint, for example. Hey, we collectors are a quirky bunch, and sometimes that's what we do. So there's some basic information on surface. Next time we'll discuss another key element of antique collecting. Well, I want to thank our guests for coming in and talking to us today. Ed Halderson for all of that interesting information and objects of mid-century modern. And I want to thank Lauren Garland for coming in and talking to us about those great little ginger beer bottles. I'm going to be looking for those when I go out next time. And I hope you enjoyed our education clip. I tried to pass along some information that I hope will be useful to you in your collecting. So join us next week. We'll have another great show.